Well, good morning. As you know, Vote Leave is a designated group, and we have a collective leadership of three people: Gisela Stewart, Michael Gove, Boris Johnson. All three of them I've watched over the years in Parliament, and I have no hesitation in saying that I have never found the slightest trace of racism in anything that they have said or done, and I am not prepared to stay silent while their reputations are besmirched. We all know that we are going to need courage and determination to face the British people with the facts, as they are constantly distorted during this campaign. In my judgment, the risks of leaving the EU over a decade or more are far less than the risk of remaining. So we must have the courage of our convictions, state what we believe in, and state it as far as possible in a way that is not destroyed and damaged by personality conflicts and false allegations. Now, I submitted for the designation of the Vote Leave an argument why the sort of left-of-centre view needed to be represented, and I showed them a poll which showed that 19% after the general election would have been more likely to have voted Labour if that party had promised a referendum. And as I go around the country, I find many people who are not involved in the blue-on-blue warfare that's going on the front pages of most newspapers, but are currently thinking very hard about these issues and are ready to use their vote intelligently and on the basis of facts. So I will only give you today questions which I have found raised in the campaign so far, and broadly speaking, how I've answered them. They are personal views. And there is a much longer press release, and it's all on the record, and it will be distributed to you very shortly. The first question is, what has changed in the EU from the last referendum in 1975? Well, it is absolutely clear. It is the euro. The fact that we now should not talk about just the EU, but always bracket it with the Eurozone. This experimental currency has changed everything in the politics of Europe. Europe was reasonably successful. I know many people were opposed to it all along, and I respect their position, but that has never been mine. But it really began to have its very roots questioned with the failure of the euro, coins and notes introduced in 2002. When the global economic crisis hit us in 2008, the euro was from the start exposed, and within a year we were in a euro crisis as distinct from the global economic crisis. And we are still there, and we are likely to remain there. Mervyn King, in his new book, with the thought-provoking word alchemy in its title, is both clear and simple. The euro crisis will continue. A euro collapse will follow, unless, in effect, it becomes a country, and that emerges inside the EU to run their currency with both a fiscal and a federal union. Why should the centre-left vote to leave? Often comes up. The answer, I think, is that the socially progressive Europe, which many people, and I certainly hoped would come out, died in the austerity following the euro crisis of 2010. Over the last 6 years, since the EU-Eurozone crisis began, the European Council and the Commission have done a great deal to destroy the very concept of the social market. They've acquiesced in levels of unemployment in EU countries not seen since the post-Second World War economic collapse. Over 50% of youth unemployment under 25s, has been quite commonplace. Uncontrolled migration has also reached huge levels with far-reaching social consequences, all too often ignored and very rarely provided with the offsetting financial resources. In some countries, in terms of pay and pensions, the wealthy have surged ahead, while the average worker has been lucky to hold their own. Standards in terms of public services, whether the health, education, and housing, have suffered immensely. I have a house in Greece. I have watched the collapse of the euro and the damage that has been done in that country painfully over the last 6 years. Go into the local pharmacy and you see empty shelves. Go into the streets and you see young people with no prospect of jobs whatever. Now, it is necessary for us to take into account, when we look at this question, how dysfunctional the EU has become over the last 6 years. The other thing to say to people is if we were to leave, this is almost the best possible moment to leave. Remember, this is not a general election. This is meant to be a fairly conducted referendum in which the people are asked to give a choice of direction. Stay inside the EU or leave the EU. It is the government of the day that carries out that direction. And this government has been in office for over 6 years, is reasonably experienced. We have fixed-term parliaments. For the next 4 years, the transition will be conducted by this government. There was no real prospect of a general election. It's a general election-free period, which is what you need if you're going to conduct this transition. Now, I'm not sure enough people have focused on the underlying pressure that has been there for decades within the all things European, starting in 1956, but even before that in the European coal and steel community, which is the perfectly respectable aim of creating a United States of Europe. It happens to be one which I have never wanted. It was Hugh Gaitskell, when leader of the Labour Party in 1962, who first flagged up that this was the objective and the aim, and that if it were to come about, it would present a major challenge to this country's democracy as a self-governing country. Now, I believe that point where it has come, and I believe it came particularly when the Prime Minister, though little commented at the time, agreed, and this is the statement that he made as part of his so-called renegotiation: Britain shall not impede the implementation of legal acts directly linked to the functioning of the euro, and furthermore will not create obstacles but facilitate such a further deepening. And deepening has real meaning inside the European community. It means taking a whole raft of measures, such are in the 5 Presidents' report, of directly electing the President of the Commission, the President of the Council, the more powers to the European Parliament, and all done on Europe-wide basis, basically to try and clear up what is widely seen as a democratic deficit. Now, it's fair enough, this direction, but be aware of it. That is what will happen if we decide to vote to remain. It will be seen as a license to move this whole momentum forward towards a United States of Europe. And it will, for some people, make sense. It is more likely that the euro will stay. And we know that the finance minister of Germany and the Holland, the Dutch, have basically accepted that the euro will not under any circumstances go. So what we will see under this pressure is a smaller grouping of the 19 creating a United States of Europe, basically to support the euro and make the structural changes that people like Mervyn King and others have long predicted are necessary. And remember that the Bundesbank warned when the euro came into being that it would need this underpinning of federal structures, fiscal unions, and the capacity to transfer money from different parts of the Eurozone, like we have in this country and like any country which has a currency normally has. Now, it's noteworthy that on the 27th of April, Michael Heseltine, a prominent conservative and a supporter of remaining in the EU, was honestly saying his view. One day, he said, we will join the euro. There's no hurry, and I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime. He's 83, I'm 77. There are many like him in the Remain campaign, closet federalists who take his view but pretend euro entry will never happen. David Cameron even now claims it will never happen, but he's retiring before the end of this Parliament. The facts of matter are promises are cheap at this stage, but there is an underlying pressure for a United States of Europe, and it will be given a huge uplift and momentum if we were to vote to remain, and we should face up to this. Now, other people ask, tell us the truth about immigration. Well, the total cost of EU founding principle of free movement of labour and people is unknown. Firstly, I do not believe that free movement of people and labour is essential for a single market. I think it is essential for a single currency, and it's certainly essential for a single country. It is a relic of those parts of the founding principles which were aiming quite overtly under Monnet and others for a United States of Europe. The already hard-pressed British taxpayer sees the budgetary cost of the EU rising, and in my view, we have to utilize that money that we would save if we come out in a way that deals with the problems that we are seeing up and down our country because of the consequences of immigration. We have to have a positive message. My own personal view, and it could only be done by a government, it can't be done by this campaign, is that the 10 billion a year, 50 billion if you spent it over 5 years, that we save from coming out, and those are uncontroversial figures, allowing for all the different adjustments and everything like that, and there's an annex to my speech which explains this quagmire of the European budget. Say, starting on the 1st of July 2018, if we have a transition period of 2 years, I would call it a national dividend, rather like we had called the peace dividend after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when we were able to substantially reduce defense budgets. Though I must say, I warn you now, I believe we will have to start to restore some of those defense budgets. And such a national dividend must not go out to government departments in Whitehall. If possible, it should be handled by a minister without portfolio. And it should only take in claims on it from those parts of the country in the UK that are suffering from this very substantial increase in migration. We know, and Jack Straw admitted it, that the Labour Party did make a spectacular mistake in the estimation of East Europeans coming to this country. I'm not one to say that it hasn't benefited us. I think it has substantially benefited us in many respects. But we know that other people have suffered from it, and we have never had the resources going in. If you look at the pressure, say, on the National Health Service, which should be one of the areas, the accident and emergency services have become extremely strained. Why? One of the reasons is that people who first come to this country are much less likely to use their GP and much more likely to use the acute services. We need to buttress those hospitals that are in these areas with extra resources. I'd pay 50% of that 10 billion. And then you look at schools. Because of this, not anticipating this increase in immigration, there have not been enough places available in primary schools, and more people have had to face a situation that they've not been able to get their choice, the one that's nearest their homes. We should alleviate that, and that means building more, providing more resources. And then you look at housing, exactly the same problem. There aren't the low-cost housing in the places where people work. they have to move right out into the suburbs, pay high travel costs. And it is very important, again, in these areas of high immigration, where there is a real shortage of low-cost housing, that we put in money. But do not apply this right across the country as a whole. Make it a special way of dealing with, through no fault of their own, these communities have been faced by higher immigration and social strains and tensions. Now, I'm absolutely confident that this country can live in harmony with many different immigration spells, where they come from the European Union, which, remember, come automatically. We do not control our borders. They come because we are obligated under the treaty to give free entry. And although we check their passports, let's be quite clear about it. With the ECJ hanging, the European Court of Justice hanging in the background, there are very considerable limits on who we can stop. And I think, therefore, to control our own borders, to have more control over who comes in, which is commonplace in Australia and other countries. So we have a quota system, and you have people coming in who can contribute to the economy. All of this means that the good sense of the British people, which has experienced waves of immigration in the past, pretty well all of them have been beneficial and have been taken into our communities and are now much prized people within them. But you can't do this if you don't A, control your borders, and B, use resources to help those people that are facing the strains and stresses within. Now, I also think that we now have to face up to one of the other questions, which is how much longer we can put up with this interference that is coming from particularly abroad. Madame Lagarde, I personally don't take great exception to what the Governor of the Bank of England did. It's a tricky position, but let's be clear. The Governor of the Bank of England has a few areas of total independence, but the large part of the Governor of the Bank of England is in serving the government of the day, and that has always been the situation. But Madame Lagarde has come in with the so-called proposals from the IMF. I must say I have some doubt as to how much that has really gone through the IMF procedure. But much more importantly, she's now told us that they're going to come at this issue again, and in June. Now, June is clearly and absolutely in the purdah period which faces us. Now, I think it is absolutely essential that the Cabinet Secretary writes, if necessary, to the Chancellor of the Exchequer and has him write to Madame Lagarde and ask her not to come back during the purdah period. She's had her go, fair enough, we've had to listen to it. It is a French view, and not, in my view, an IMF view, as she and Strauss-Dominic Kahn have conducted themselves in the IMF. I think it's very unlikely we'll ever have another European member head of the IMF. But it is not an unwarranted interference. Now, I also want to say this about how we leave, which is another question that keeps coming up. And that is the question of why this referendum was ever called. It is now absolutely clear that the Cabinet were never given a paper from the Treasury or any other government departments about the effects of coming out of the EU. I think it was personally because most people thought that it was a balanced judgment and it was perfectly fair for the Prime Minister to make this decision in his Bloomberg speech to have a referendum. But then it is similarly the case that no Cabinet papers were put from the Treasury or anyone else warning the Cabinet about making a manifesto commitment to have the referendum and the timing of that referendum before the end of 2017. It is a constitutional outrage and a dereliction of duty that those papers were not presented if the current one that is before us, the current Treasury objectives, and another one I gather is likely to come next week. If it was so dire, if the consequences were so dreadful, if all the propaganda that has been pushed out from that, why was that not presented to the Cabinet 3 years earlier, 2 years earlier, 1 year earlier? And we need to ask those questions. It raises fundamental questions about this referendum, whether it is being conducted fairly and objectively from number 10, and I believe it is not. And the Cabinet Secretary will be held responsible for this by history. But that's not the end of it. The Cabinet Secretary is responsible for the fairness of this referendum by legislation that has been passed by Parliament. He has already been forced to change his mind about some aspects of the Purdah ruling by a select committee, and he, in my view, is given this responsibility. The Electoral Commission doesn't seem to want to get involved, and they think it's the responsibility of the Cabinet Secretary. Now, what happens if we stay? I've already said, and that's one of the constant questions, that the threat of a Eurozone collapse is being considerably underestimated. The Greek crisis is effectively on hold at the moment, and I understand why. Funding is made available in order for them to handle the very difficult situation they have with the need to try to return people to Turkey in order for them, Turkey, to push some of their people in their country, not push because they want to go, to other parts of the EU. Well, all I can say is be careful, and I say it sadly. I do not myself see at the moment that the Greek crisis is anywhere near resolved. But much more important is to look at those aspects of the Italian economy, and which in Annex C I give a lot of the figures, and in some of my speech I do too. Italy is facing very serious problems living within the disciplines of the Eurozone. And this is the problem. If you go within the Eurozone, you have to accept financial disciplines. If you can't accept those financial disciplines, the Eurozone starts to crack. And we need to take those risks into account. Now, some people will tell you that it doesn't matter because we are not in the Eurozone. Go to Greece and you will see it does matter. The knock-on effects of a collapse of a country of the size of Italy would be very considerable. So when we hear all these risk assessments, let's have a risk assessment of what are the chances of Italy not being able to stay in. At the moment, quantitative easing, various measures are being made by the ECB, but look at the underlying position, and frequently we have had experts analysing this situation. Well, what about the Treasury analysing this situation? And what about the IMF analysing this situation, instead of just focusing their very narrowed view on what are the potential risks of British leaving the European Union? So I would only say this about some other questions. What are the opportunities outside the EU for this country? I think they are very considerable, but they need time, and we need an adjustment. We've been completely open and frank about this. But the idea that this transition period will be so difficult, say we take a 2-year transition, we might decide to opt for taking no changes whatever in our arrangements within the single market during that time. We might decide we want a different arrangement. All of this needs discussion. And it is not acceptable that on the 24th of June, if we are successful, as I very much hope we are on the 23rd, the Prime Minister announces that we will sign up to Article 50 of the treaties. It is no job of the Prime Minister under those circumstances. It is the job of the Cabinet that meets, of Parliament that needs to discuss these decisions, of the papers that should have been presented to Cabinet over the last 3 years to be presented to them and then come forward with recommendations and make decisions. There are very important issues underlying all that, some of which I deal with this in detail when I'm asked questions by it. Now, the other questions are things like what lies behind the idea of a United States of Europe. I'm not going to go into all of this now, but it does behove some of our more, if you like, detached columnists who write long pieces to analyze the momentum behind a United States of Europe, to look at what Monnet wanted. That's what Gaitskell did in 1962. He met with Monnet, he met with Spark, and he understood their passion and their commitment to it. And we must say to the British people that this vote to remain is a vote to make it far, far more likely that they will find themselves in a United States of Europe. That Michael Heseltine's wish for a euro, that was not just shared by Michael Heseltine. I came into this issue in 1999 in order to form a group called New Europe, which worked with Business for Sterling, to prevent Tony Blair calling a referendum on the back of what was called the Baghdad bounce. Of course, it never occurred, but he would have been very hard to have defeated in, say, 2003, if that had been successful. And in my view, most of his Labour colleagues who were dissenting at that time from joining the euro would have gone along with it. And we needed an all-party grouping to try and put the case against the euro. And the case against the euro, as I say, is not just economic. It is political. It is the paving stone for going in and maybe having to go in very fast in terms of a collapse. And we have signed away all our rights and veto powers on all aspects of the euro and all aspects of the deepening of the Eurozone and the European Union. Beware. This is not false alarms. This is facts, and we should take it seriously. I was in Paris in April on a meeting of the European movement. I've always respected the European movement. On that platform was Michel Rocard, who is a former Prime Minister of France, an old friend of mine ever since the 60s. He's a committed federalist. He wanted and still wants to be a United States of Europe and for France to be in it. Good luck to them. But he knows that I've always opposed federalism, and I haven't just done it on myself. The Cabinet in 1977 had an all-day meeting discussing what was the direction of Europe post the 1975 referendum, called by Jim Callaghan, and I wrote the papers for it at his specific request. And it was very clear that we were committed to the new European community on the basis that it would not become a federalist union. And it is these things in the past which, of course, create great ambivalence inside the Labour Party about Europe. But I believe that amongst many of its voters, there is a real wish to grapple with this issue and come to some firm conclusions. I'll leave by saying this. It also means, if we come out of the EU, that we come out of the common foreign and security policy, we come out of this German new proposals that have been held back, again, from the referendum, for a EU defence structure and planning functions, exactly what the United States have been against. I must say, I almost laugh at the situation. The latest input from the United States today is the former mayor of New York and the very successful business head of Bloomberg. Of course he's entitled to come. He employs people in this country. And if you read his speech, which has already been in the Times, it's very moderately phrased. He says he's not here to influence anybody. Well, we used to say, tell that to the Marines. But basically he's here to influence our debate. Well, that's fair enough. But the number of people who come from America not seeming to realize that the State Department has had a long-standing commitment to a United States of Europe in which we would lose all our self-government. It's only been checked by the Pentagon. The Ministry of Defense knows that it wants NATO and it does not want that type of degree of political integration. But they all want us to stay in the EU to put the American view, which is commonly often ours, on economic, political and defense policy. Fair enough. I understand that. But we have other decisions to take which relate to our own people. And when Mr. Bloomberg expresses concern about the effect of leaving on the wages or the job opportunities in Bloomberg in the City of London, he should remember what those wages are in comparison to the wages of the average person in this country. He should realize what their employment prospects have been in comparison to the average person employed in this country. And it does seem to me that our elite, our political elite, have got hugely out of touch with what is actually happening in this country. And it's not happening just in this country. It's happening in the world. It's happening in America. What is this reaction in Middle America that is really surging through their polls? Well, they should analyze that first, really, before coming here to tell us what we should do about it. And that's why I believe President Obama, who I support and strongly approve of and my wife votes for, got really a bloody nose in terms of the opinion polls. The general British public, I hope, will see the 23rd of June as Independence Day, our equivalent of what the Americans call Independence Day, when we take back those powers of self-government that we had deprived them of as a country all those centuries ago. So I'll now leave it open to you to ask questions, and I'll be very happy to deal with them. But there's a lot of detail. There are annexes. I think if those who are interested to read the case I put to the Electoral Commission of why it should be designated, because this was not just a Conservative Party argument, but an argument going much broader than that. The annexes on the Article 50 and also Article 8 of the treaties, which talks about good neighbourliness, which I think should guide our treaty negotiations. Also the funding and the budget arrangements, which many people come in commenting on, explaining why 350,000 is effectively backed up by the ONS numbers. Whether we should use that sum, the ONS takes a different view, but at least it explains the arithmetic. And finally, an analysis of what is happening in Italy. So, first question.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you, Lord Owen. Chris Ship from ITV News. You're, if I may say so, a rare beast in that you're a non-Conservative, non-UKIP member of Vote Leave standing on that stage, giving us your arguments about why we should leave. Can I just ask for your reaction to a couple of the more controversial statements over the last week? Boris's comments about Hitler, we can argue about what exactly he meant, but they were definitely written in the same sentence in the same newspaper. And also Nigel Farage telling the BBC that violence is the next step if people don't get what they want, if Leave campaigners don't get what they want on June the 23rd. And a second point, if I may ask, you've just said that the EU contributions are £10 billion a week. You'll be aware that Boris Johnson and others are driving around in a big red bus saying it's £350 million.
Okay, well, I'll interrupt on that.
So, in other words, you're driving around in a bus with a big fat lie on it because you've just admitted in your speech it's £190 million a week, not £350.
Well, a big fat lie is a rather unobjective statement, if I do. I'm going to. You come from. I'm too old to remember, you know. But you come from ITV. I thought that was an objective news reporting organisation. So I would refer you to what I would prefer to do is that I've honestly answered that, and it's an annex of what the paper's there, and perhaps it might help you objectively reporting about all of this. It's very complicated. The Treasury holds a different figure to the ONS, and the people have got many different views on it. But undisputed 10 billion, in my view, of savings if we left, and I've also explained to you how I think we could deal with it. As to Mr. Farage, I'll answer the questions.
10 billion pounds a year, 190 million a week.
I asked the question. You asked the question. Yeah. I've given you the answer. I'm now moving. Yes, I've given you the answer. And there are other people. Perhaps you might think there's some other people going to ask the question. I've given you the answer.
I'm just saying it's not on the side of the bus. On the side of the bus is 350 million a week, which is 20 billion a week.
Whose side are you on in this debate? Are you in a side of objective truth or not? I've given you the objective truth, and it's in the annex, and I hope you read it. Now, as to the question of Farage, I don't hold that view because I have confidence enough in the British people that they will not resort to violence. They don't resort to violence even in the most extreme circumstances we've had in long strikes and other issues. And we have seen off the British National Front, and we have seen off most of these expression movements. But unless we tackle the concerns about immigration, which are genuine and real, and utilize our capacity to make the savings which I've said in those areas of the country that need alleviation in the National Health Service, in housing, and in education, we will go on perpetuating this dissociation, really, of millions of our people from its elite. And I think warn about that. Next question.
About Boris.
Oh, Boris. Well, I personally think that in the context that he was talking about, which is the different empires that have arisen in Europe, all of which have failed, from Charlemagne onwards, he's right to point out that this drive for expansion, for more size, that size alone faces it, and size with the currency. After all, Charlemagne started it, and that currency failed. Perfectly reasonable to point out that there have been many different expansions, and I'm not going to go into them more, but that's perfectly reasonable comment. If you want to, he said, by very different methods. And I think, of course, everybody knew what he meant by very different methods. And I think that, again, this is a grotesque example of trying to rubbish somebody's reputation on the basis of no evidence whatever. Yes?
Following on from our ITV friend's last question, just by way of balance, do you think it perhaps ill-behoves the Prime Minister of our country to be talking in such emotive terms as the implications of a Leave vote being, for example, to make World War III more likely, and also perhaps to make it that ISIS would perhaps prefer us to vote Leave? Do you think those are also examples of intended
I wrote what I wanted to about the claim that Third World War was inevitable in the Sun newspaper, and they expressed it pretty graphically in a cartoon, photographic cartoon of Churchill. As far as the ISIL one, I think that we've seen a huge number of exaggerated and ridiculous propaganda movements, and I'm sure we'll all pick our best, but I should have said worst. But the Prime Minister's saying that ISIL would be happy on a Brexit is the most extraordinary statement of all. And I think we've got to be very careful about this whole security question. A decent silence is quite a good idea on most of issues of security, and that applies to both MI6 and MI5. I was responsible for 2.5 years for MI6, and I believe it's an outstanding organization. But its strength and its virtues are it is silent. We used to call the Navy the silent service. And it's not a good or pretty sight seeing these various arguments about security being prayed around in this issue. We all know perfectly well that as far as borders and countries' borders, sharing information to deal with terrorism is done to their best of ability across all countries. Now, even Russia participates in very helpful intelligence transfers and has done. To some extent, that's been perhaps lessened in recent years, but I hope it is soon restored. And we need to be very careful about this. And I don't believe it's exclusive to the EU. All EU countries will pass on information to non-EU countries wherever it makes sense, and all NATO countries. The problem is that what information you pass is itself very difficult to do. Sometimes you're bound, you can't do it. So I just think that that's another example where you can very easily get into the gutter of politics by raising such an important, normally bipartisanly handled issue such as security. Right at the back.
On my travels, I meet a lot of people who deeply agree with most of the principles that you discussed today, and they understand this loss of sovereignty, and yet this is trumped by their short-term personal economic concerns of the risks. What advice would you give them?
Well, take a longer view. Now, it's perfectly understandable that people with certain commitments and certain feelings, either in their job or elsewhere, might take the view, my job is more at risk than others, and it will affect their voting behavior. And that's perfectly reasonable. And giving objective facts to people on this is not unreasonable. But, you know, we do know certain things. We do know that trade agreements are entered into for mutual advantage. Nobody does it on any other basis, and that's what it's always been and always should be. And so when people predict that you will not make trade agreements, they know that they are not telling the truth. The question for us as a campaign is we're not the government. We aren't into those negotiations. We don't know what is going to be the response of the European single market, the EEA, which contains some countries that are not even in it. And we ought to have had all those objective information put before us, as I said, first to the Cabinet, then to Parliament, and then at an election, if you have a manifesto commitment to have a referendum, have the referendum, but have it fairly. You know, that's the issue. Why do you have referendum? It's because parties are split. If in a referendum, the Cabinet Secretary has a very heavy responsibility to try and make sure that it doesn't just become another way of getting the Prime Minister's way. A Cabinet Secretary, I sometimes wonder whether he knows the meaning of the word cabinet and thinks it's a sort of piece of furniture which should be moved from time to time to whichever Prime Minister he happens to be serving as a sort of presidential seat. Now, we've got to get back to some standards of objectivity and truth. We didn't in the 1975 referendum handle the relationship between the Foreign Office and the Cabinet Office and the campaign very well, and we have since then learnt on referendums. That's why we have designated groupings. It seems to me absolutely extraordinary. The Prime Minister should deciding who he should stand up against. The designated group should choose who takes it part in these various encounters, whether it's ITV or BBC or Sky, and then the Prime Minister should be part of it if he wants to be. We're in the Purdah period. We need objectivity. Otherwise, referendum will fall into total disrepute. Maybe people want that to happen. But it is a device when parties are conflicted, and it needs objectiveness and truth, and people will vote, as you say, sometimes on their pockets. After all, they do in general elections. Jim Callaghan coined the phrase, the jingle in the pocket. This is not something to disparage. But I think they ought to look at unemployment levels in Europe. They ought to look at some of the consequences of what's happening out there in the organization which they are being asked to remain in. Right? Yeah.
Do you believe that it's economically literate, not economically illiterate, but literate to believe that uncapped immigration, typically lower skilled and unskilled workers, i.e. excessive supply for fixed demand, will push down the price of labour, push down wages, and that's what we're seeing?
Well, the trouble is that the economists who've looked at this have come up with very conflicting views. Common sense would say it would, well, at least whole wages, they wouldn't rise as fast. And that's one of the reasons why employers like it. And I think we've got to be quite blunt about that. But there are other benefits, of course, that come from having immigrant labour. The problem is this free movement of labour provision. It was fine when we were a community of 9. It was fine when we were a community of 15. When we made the good decision and the right decision to take in a lot of other countries from Eastern Europe, it became a major issue. And then we have the Prime Minister. I know under the pressure he was from Angela Merkel in order to do a deal with Turkey. But to say that you are going to speed up the entry of Turkey into the EU, when we've all known that freedom of movement of labour is one of the reasons why we've stopped and slowed down Turkey's application. It seems to me you're in danger of giving, it's this presentism, this pretend, so that Turkish people feel that they soon will be in the European Union. When they discover they're not, I only hope they don't, in disillusionment, pull out of NATO, where I believe they play an extremely important and valuable role. But nobody's saying that everybody would come, but it would certainly, a country of 75 million, would add to the likely numbers that are coming in. And as I say, we've all underestimated it before. And I want to see ONS, which I respect, incidentally, given a greater role in this, and the government stepped right back from it. ONS insisted in the 1970 election that we publish the balance of payments figures to the embarrassment of the then Labour government when I was kicked out of government. Very salutary, very important. I've been kicked out of government twice, in 70 and in 1979. Didn't feel like it at the time, but in retrospect, I think it was a perfectly reasonable decision. A lot of this is about, can you kick the buggers out? You can't in many parts of the European Union. In many aspects of European life, it's quite impossible to make a democratic political choice, and qualified voting, necessary for a single market, I don't deny that, but it does mean you lose an awful lot of votes, and sometimes votes on important matters. And incidentally, I think that's what Mr. Bloomberg should be worried about. How much safeguarding is there for the City of London as in the if you remain? Not a lot, in my view. There have been eyeing the City of London for years. I think there will be another move to check it. And all the Prime Minister's got, basically, is you can raise this matter in the European Council. No provision for a vote, no automatic right to do so. That was pointed out by the Deputy Chairman of the Bank of England the other day. So be careful, look at the small print of these commitments of how the EU has not been reformed by the Prime Minister's renegotiation any more than it was reformed by the renegotiation of Harold Wilson and Jim Callaghan. And most of us knew that in 1975, and all of you know it in 2000 and wherever we are. Okay, yes, bye.
Lord Owen, I'm trying to work out from your speech whether or not are you accusing Sir Jeremy Hayward of not having prepared economic options papers and shown them to the Cabinet before the Prime Minister called the referendum or not? And can I ask you, do you think that Sir Jeremy should stay in office, or is it time for him to go?
It's not my job to. Civil service are protected by civil service procedures, and quite rightly so that they are not. They don't lose their jobs at the say-so of a politician, even the Prime Minister. Of course, it does effectively can change it. No, I'm not going to get into whether it is employment or not. I will get into his responsibilities, which is to ensure that there is a proper level playing field for the debate during the referendum, and in particular, as we get closer to it. And I do think that we have seen evidence that the views of the Treasury, which are now presented in a referendum period about leaving, as I understand it, none of those assessments, none of that analysis ever went to the Cabinet before the Prime Minister made his speech, perhaps inappropriately, at Bloomberg's. And furthermore, that they did not present a similar assessment, anything remotely like, I gather practically nothing at all, before the manifesto commitment, which both told us we were going to have a referendum if they won the election, and also fixed the parameters for it, that it had to take place before 2017. So here we are, in 2016, having a referendum, and suddenly hearing what the Treasury apparently think of it. Well, all I'm saying is that type of analysis, that type of gloom and doom should have been heard around the Cabinet paper before you even called a referendum. And I think that's just a basic, fundamental, constitutional duty of the civil service, and as the Cabinet Secretary is the head of the civil service, to see that it is placed in front of them. They are not just serving the Prime Minister, they are serving the Cabinet of different views and different people, and that should have been presented. And I think it was a grave dereliction of duty that it was not. Yes.
Could I just say, they keep saying this is the final time that we can get in or out. For instance, if they gave Turkey free access, couldn't we just vote to come out? How can they keep us imprisoned if they change their views and policies?
Well, to admit a new member to the European Union, it has to be a unanimous decision. So we have got a veto over the admission of Turkey. We have a veto on some aspects, very, very, very much curtailed. If you look at the issues you could have vetoed way back when we joined in 73, they're very, very much less. But we do have some vetoes on that. And we have some vetoes on some aspects of defence still. But all the time they are eroded. They're eroded by the European Court of Justice, which is basically set up with the aim of having eventually a United States of Europe. And still we haven't changed the treaties over the euro. The euro actually, in the Treaty of Maastricht, says that all member states are heading towards the euro. except for ourselves and the Danes that have an opt-out. Sweden, which is an economy does fulfill the characteristics to be able to go in, has stayed outside, arguably in contradiction to the treaty. They create some sort of, and they fluff it, they flannel it. And that's the same for some other countries. But basically, the things that we can veto are not very great. And what we will find if we stay is, because of the Prime Minister's commitments not to interfere on the euro structuring or on deepening, that they move ever more towards the United States of Europe, and we never really come to a point where we can't. Then somebody like the equivalent of Michael Heseltine argues, or Ken Clarke argues inside a Conservative government, there's no problem, it will also be done inside Labour governments, to go into the euro. And they will go into the euro. Now, at the moment, we have a commitment, we have to have a referendum for that. But actually, under our constitution, it's perfectly possible for a government to say, we will make this a manifesto pledge, and then that overrides a referendum. And that's exactly what Labour asked to be done on membership of the EU in 1983. So they wanted to deprive you of the referendum. Well, it didn't help them. But it is constitutionally capable of doing it. So this business saying we will never join the euro is manifestly untrue. You could either decide to do it and have a referendum and say to people, you know, the eurozone might reform. We might be faced then with purely political decision. The eurozone's okay economically. People say, well, now we can go in. The political ramifications of joining a single currency are huge in terms of becoming part of the United States of Europe. It's a snaffle process that we're watching and observing. Right at the back.
Can I just follow on? How would you
No, I think one question each, please, if you don't mind. Can you speak up? I'm having a bit of difficulty.
Yes, Mike, thanks. To what extent would you agree with Professor Patrick Minford insofar as regarding free trade agreements? Actually, they're somewhat of a red herring because, of course, notwithstanding the requirement under Article 50 to have one, and notwithstanding the fact that, for example, the EU concluded one with Ukraine in a matter of months, actually it's not politicians who dictate the terms of trade, it's businesses in one country that trade with businesses in another country. And simply having an agreement not to impose tariffs isn't necessary. You could simply not impose tariffs.
Well, for 20 years, I've really been in business. I've not been a politician. And it is quite true that politicians keep on going to documents and regulations and forget that the fundamental trade is on price. Price is the key thing, and quality. And if you get the price right and you get the quality, you'll penetrate any market. And Britain has shown that it can do this. After all, we've moved over the last 10 years, and Patrick Minford's book does explain this. We've moved away from the European single market 10% out to the global world. Now, if you can do that in 10 years, and you make a real determined commitment, and you make bilateral trade agreements, that shift can be much faster, in my view. So I think we need to be very careful about. These are difficult questions. We have, in some areas of the EEA, advantageous trade terms for people getting through. Somebody who wants to stay selling into Europe will basically keep their manufactured products in line with European regulations. You give up the chance to influence those regulations, but on the other hand, it is only an influence, and you gain the chance to sell your goods in wider markets because you've got trade arrangements. These are balance of issues. But what is interesting, and this is the most important thing to remember, we hear from the corporates. They seem to dominate the news gathering procedures. Endlessly heads of a big corporation are rolled out. These people are very happy to lobby in Brussels for a preferential deal for their large corporation. The people who are basically with us and growing in substantial numbers are the smaller businesses who really do feel the effects of the regulations and who want to be free to trade globally, want to have the shackles off, are entrepreneurial in mind, are adventurous in spirit, and are facing up to the need for this country to rejuvenate itself outside the EU and confident that you can do it. The politicians are largely not, but Minford has done a great deal of work on alternative models, markets, and everything like that. But at the end of the day, the message I come away from it is basically a contract between the seller and the buyer. And we keep forgetting this. These trade agreements are very marginal. I mean, and most of them are actually going to collapse. In my view, we're going to see most of these big American trade agreements. I mean, at the moment, the two presidential candidates are against the Asian trade agreement that Obama's negotiated. I don't think that's going to go very fast. These big trading agreements, this big thing, the inability of WTO to get trade agreements through is all part of this big institutional world. It's the people who think that they make the rules for a world which has become computerized, which has become much faster, much lighter on its feet, is very different business. And I sometimes think, in talking to my political colleagues and friends, they forget that this business out there, you know, I used to be involved in trading steel. I mean, the rapidity with which they make their decisions on price would quite stagger you. And I mean, it's just a very different marketplace than one that we see described in political documents. Now, last one question, right at the back. Yes, at the back.
To what extent will our dodgy postal vote system impact on the result of the referendum?
Voting system?
The postal voting system.
I really don't know. I mean, you know, there was a time when I would know, but I haven't fought an election since '87, and I really don't know. All I will say is this. I feel very, very strongly about this. The more people vote, the better. Now, I'm told that is against my interest. So be it. In a democracy, you want to have the maximum number of people voting. So I go around to universities encouraging young people to vote. That may or may not mean that more of them vote to stay or more of them vote to leave. But I do want it to be clear that if we're going to respect this referendum, we have to respect the great majority of people to try and vote, and the rules and the regulations and the circumstances under which we do it need to be abided by from the Prime Minister downwards. If I had to say the three people who have done more to corrupt this process, it would be first the Prime Minister, second the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and thirdly the Cabinet Secretary. It is very, very serious development that we have not been able to hold a proper referendum. Thanks a lot.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.